start using symbols in order. The theory of accumulative and non-accumulative process is one critique of the idea of progress. Philosophical and sociological critique of this idea has become rudimentary and banal, since it is dictated by the most obvious and most easily provable facts. An entirely optimistic idea that progress could spread simultaneously through every area, an idea which was linked to a simplistic evolutionism, has quite literally collapsed during the course of the 20th century. After Hegel and Marx, the general theory of dialectical movement had stipulated that the process of becoming in all sectors, nature, history, knowledge, would surely be more checkered, discontinuous, conflictual, driven by partial or general regressions than time as the naive evolutionist pattern represents it. Events have fully vindicated the pattern presented by dialectical thought, and more than anyone could have imagined. To uneven development, we have already stressed the extreme theoretical generality of this concept, which was introduced into Hegelian and Marxist dialectical thought by Lenin. The idea of uneven development makes the general critique of the continuist, evolutionist pattern of the process of becoming more precise, specific and particularized. In our opinion, the implications and consequences of the idea of uneven development and the law derived from it have not yet been exhausted, particularly as regards everyday life. We have already suggested the hypothesis of a period not only where the hoe with the swing plow would coexist alongside interplanetary rockets, and where small farmers would continue to work the land by hand and go hungry while an elite of technicians and managers would be exploring outer space, but also where a backward everyday life would coexist with a highly developed technology, in a way which would be difficult to bear. The situation of everyday life strikes us unfortunately as being a prime example of the law of uneven development, but the proposition can be reversed. The law of uneven development points to the possibility of an almost limitless range of human social situations at the very heart of economic and technological development, from the rearguard to the front line of action. To use a military metaphor, we know that the underdeveloped sectors do not remain quietly held back like a troop of soldiers dragging their heels far from the front line. The sectors which are destined to suffer uneven development, be it temporary or long-lasting, soon realize that they are being occupied and brutally exploited. They must regain their freedom or win it back by combat. They remain subjected. Critique of everyday life generalizes this experience of the backward or underdeveloped nations and extends it to the everyday in the highly developed industrial countries. It lays down the principle that the great upheaval which calls on the consciousness of those nations engaged in the drama of uneven development to emancipate themselves should reverberate through modernity via an upheaval of everyday life and a general upheaval in the name of everyday life. Given that it is a backward sector which is exploited and oppressed by so-called modern society, we insist that this is not simply a metaphor, an allegory, or a mere simile or superficial analogy, but that the problem is fundamentally the same. The link between the situation of the everyday and that of the proletariat goes to the heart of the problem. The transformation of the world, that is, of the everyday life of today, in modern society, given its history and its structures. It is a deplorable situation, which we have barely begun to describe, and which we must try to explain. But how did it come about? 3 non-accumulative societies among the many debts the sciences of society owe to Marx. One extremely important discovery stands out. Although he himself did not develop its consequences fully, far from it, there is a distinction between 2 major types of society. One is based economically on simple reproduction, the other on reproduction on an extended scale. To put it even more precisely, the analysis of capitalist society reveals it to contain a double process, one called simple reproduction, and the other, reproduction on an extended scale. The second supposes the first, and the first continues a process within capitalism which was inherent in pre-capitalist societies. A society should not only produce and reproduce the quantity of goods which allows its population to survive, to reproduce itself biologically, to bring up children and to maintain more or less adequately its non-productive members. This strictly economic interpretation of the patterns presented in Capital does not go deep enough. Society must also reproduce the social relations between its members. Thus, praxis as Marx describes it cannot be content merely to reconstitute a basis for consumption. It maintains production relations and the social division of labor. Social relations retain a relative stability while the members of a society are constantly changing. They are born and they die, and pass from one group to another through marriage, notably, while maintaining their relations. The praxis described in this way on the economic level is therefore not repetition in the same sense as industrial activity is. It repeats itself in cycles. Marx describes and analyzes the process of simple reproduction as a cyclic process. The patterns of simple reproduction express the distribution of human activities in a society based on a weak level of productive forces, but endowed with an inner cohesion, a structure. Societies built on a relatively stable but stagnant base are destined to be balanced in a static way. In this very stagnation they demonstrate an extraordinary ability to resist and to persist. The cohesion of primitive communities removes them from the historicity which could shatter them from without, and from the incidental history which would destroy them from within. They can be conquered and subjected, but as long as the conqueror does not annihilate them, they carry on. Structure persists by recreating itself indefinitely, in a circular way. This pattern seems valid for all pre-capitalist societies based on agriculture and handicrafts. Marx did little more than outline this kind of generalization, but it is based on the theoretical and methodological propositions intrinsic to capital and to his contribution to the critique of political economy. According to Marx, the study of capitalism sheds light on what preceded it and not vice versa, which is what evolutionism and the simplified theory of progress believed. It is self-evident that the members of a particular society are not aware of the circular process and the internal self-regulation which make them tend towards a static equilibrium. However, we should not think they are somehow unaware or falsely aware of their own praxis. The study of agrarian systems and the distribution of tasks in peasant communities reveals great practical wisdom, although this wisdom was never able to express and transmit itself conceptually, it is also self-evident that the stability of these societies was constantly being threatened by aberrant phenomena such as excesses, defects or disturbances, the hubris of Greek thought, governed by their wise men, the assemblies and councils of elders, and by priests, warlords and political chiefs. These societies employed various means to eliminate such perturbations along with their causes. Similarly, they eliminated any threat of surplus population. On this point, Marx was happy merely to present a pattern of simple reproduction and to make a few general observations which we will return to shortly. He made no attempt to determine in what way the structures of these societies were analogous or differing, nor to grasp the underlying reasons for their stability on the base as we have just described it. Here as elsewhere, this economic base allows us to know the skeleton of this society, but not how it really functioned, its physiology. It offers us conditions for possibilities, and general conditions for societies which differ greatly from each other to construct themselves. In any case, this was not a task Marx had set himself in capital. He left the job of studying pre-capitalist societies to others, notably to ethnographers. Everyone knows that in the origin of the family, private property and the state, Engels tried to fill this gap using the work of the first modern ethnographers. There is one important idea which enables us to understand the real structures of pre-capitalist societies and the reasons for the stability which has helped them to survive into our own era. We have met it before. In archaic societies, the fundamental processes are cyclic, and these cycles remain very close to cosmic cycles and the rhythms which come from nature. The economic process of simple reproduction, which, as Marx demonstrated, is cyclic in character, is an almost unnoticeable component of the cycles and rhythms which predominate as an organizing factor in these agrarian societies. Hours and days, seasons and years, generations, youth and old age. We find these societies surprising. They organize themselves in time and according to time more than in space, while significantly they have no historical time or temporality comparable to our own society but, instead, a time scale made up of intertwined cycles. We have linked these social rhythms to the most ancient of symbolisms, and we have had no problem in demonstrating their continuation. We deliberately do not say they serve other else, in our present day villages, as shattered, buried or deteriorated nucleuses. Could it be that these archaic, peasant and craft-based societies, but with embryonic commercial activity, had no history? To believe so would be a naive mistake and an absurdity. These societies have a history, a double one, but in their own particular manner which is different from our own historicity, on the one hand, and from the outside. Conquerors established vast political entities, empires, on a multitude of peasant communities, and often by the use of embryonic commercial activities, such as barter, exchanges, or the possibility of exacting tributes and taxes. In this political framework, states and dominant classes which foreshadowed feudalism or the bourgeoisie began to take shape. Immobile and almost immovable on their static and stagnating base, these empires lasted until such time as a weak tremor might lead to their sudden collapse. Empires like this have lasted until the present day. The Turkish Empire, for example. Notable among this type of political formation are the pre-Columbian American empires, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire and the Great Asiatic Empires, each with its own specific characteristics within the general context we have defined above. On the other hand, the archaic societies in question also had a complex internal history, precisely insofar as there were differences between them. By his pattern of simple reproduction, Marx drew attention to an important fact. These archaic societies had a political economy, although the economic side of it was not predominant and determinant stricto sensu. Their political economy functioned blindly, spontaneously, almost automatically as the practice of economy in the precise sense of the term when we say that someone is economical. A distribution of tasks and products which is spontaneous to begin with, but which becomes increasingly conscious, in poor societies controlled by governing groups which demand abstinence from the other groups, and sometimes from themselves. Marx criticized political economy and law as the knowledge and practice of non-abundance. Be that as it may, scarcity is a completely relative idea which cannot be taken to the absolute or be of any use as an explicative principle. A society without surplus product, in which labor allows for nothing more than the survival of its workers, will quickly disappear. In the archaic societies we are talking about, dominant groups, which were not yet classes in the exact contemporary meaning of the term, were thus able to gain control of a certain surplus labor and surplus product. It is obvious that slavery and subsequently serfdom made it possible to increase surplus labor and to extort part of the surplus product all the more easily. These dominant groups seized the surplus social product and appropriated it to their needs and works. What is remarkable is that in most of these societies the masters transformed the wealth they had levied into works, as if they felt they had to justify that levy to the people and account for it to the community, which had not yet been completely burst asunder. We use the term works in its broadest sense: monuments, festivals, permanent or transitory works of art. As yet these masters justified their existence and their predominance not by using representations and ideologies, but by symbols, which they embodied physically in a multiplicity of works. Only in this way can we understand how diverse these ancient societies were: violence and equilibrium, vitality and stability, poverty and splendor, shabbiness and beauty. In retrospect they offer us a diptych, on one panel, a realm of brutality and despotism, on the other, extraordinary creations in art, lifestyle, wisdom, culture and even philosophy, although the latter only emerges with conceptual thought and the awareness of discourse per se, which bring ancient wisdom to a close. Marxist thought contains the indications which enable us to approach the study of archaic or ancient societies in all their manifold aspects. However, there is one particularly profound and well-known question raised by Marx, and which he himself did not resolve. How is it that the bourgeois and socialist cultures of today can be interested in works from distant periods, created in conditions which were very different from our own by groups, castes, embryonic classes, which established themselves using unbridled and limitless violence, and which used the meager surplus social product to create all this sumptuousness? What can explain the lasting character of these works, these superstructures of defunct societies? At this stage we will hazard a few conceptual elements for a theory. At the heart of archaic and ancient societies, everyday life was not separate from what was highest and greatest in culture and ideas. This is something we have already pointed out. Primitive man, the archaic peasant and probably the citizen of ancient cities all knew full well how to distinguish between the sacred and the secular, the everyday and the sublime. While for us these two elements of their lives seem inextricably merged, this man may have believed that a given familiar object was possessed of an obscure power for good or for evil, but he still knew perfectly well how to put it to practical use. And he knew perfectly well when he was addressing that power and when he was not. Why? How? Because of the very nature of symbolism and of symbols, which enter the lived and duplicate or reduplicate reality without becoming separate from it. Just as every object in these societies could easily become a work of art, all that was needed was a little effort, and, far from being the exception, this effort was the rule. Absence of any art was the exception, and a sign of degeneracy. So everyday life could easily become a lifestyle. Every change in the men who commanded these societies and in the symbols which they used would have an influence on style in the everyday. It would be grandiose, sublime, sensual, sensuous, erotic or violent, according to the men and to the circumstances. From the very first peasant societies which saw the birth of meditation to the great empires and even to the Greek city-states, almost every possible stylistic hypothesis was attempted. Now if the analysis we are attempting here is at all correct, our own everyday life has a double character. On one hand, it has no style, in the context of a history which is moving ever farther away from the everyday, and of a globalized society which holds sway over it from the empyrean realms of the state. The utilitarian and the functional constitute not a style, but its opposite, the absence of style. On the other hand, there are some very ancient symbolisms which alone are able to restore some strength to gestures and actions which have been robbed of all meaning. Although they have deteriorated and shattered, they still form effective nucleuses which, however destructive or inadequate, are still active. How could we not grasp the works of the past? They interest us, they fascinate us, and we call upon them desperately to give us a sense and a style. In the name of the vast emptiness which is everyday life, our everyday life, we look towards everything which could point to or perpetuate a plenitude. Any age, it does not matter which. It is not aesthetic sensibility or ideology which acts as mediator, but everyday life. However, our interest in the objects and ideas of distant societies labors under one serious misconception. We perceive them as art objects, whereas in fact this art was not something external to the everyday or, as is supposed, high above it and trying in vain to enter it, but a style of life. What we perceive as theories and philosophies were in fact ways of everyday living. This is why the more we return to these objects and ideas, the more they disturb us. We are well aware that we do not understand them. We look for their historic context. When there was no history analogous to ours, their social context. When there was no society analogous to ours, or their ideological context. When abstract, ideological representations had not yet appeared, and concretely lived cosmic symbols and rhythms close to cosmic rhythms predominated. For the concept of the process of accumulation, simple reproduction is and remains a necessary condition for all social life. From a certain date onwards, at the end of the Middle Ages in the European West, it gives way to another process, that of accumulation on an extended scale. Marx studied it schematically, restricting it to the economic point of view, and knowing full well that this level of reality does not encompass reality as a whole. In capital he determined the reciprocal proportions of the different sectors of production which are essential for the effective development of reproduction on an extended scale. That is, the accumulation of capital. 3. Marx did not specify the historical conditions and diverse conjunctures which allow or allowed for the insertion of the process of accumulation into stable structures governed by the previous type of process. The process of accumulation profoundly modifies and overturns the previous process. It does not abolish it, it encompasses it, and introduces the fundamental contradiction between the social character of productive labor and the private ownership of the means of production. Despite this fundamental contradiction, which will develop into the polarized and antagonistic bourgeoisie-proletariat class contradiction, society must remain coherent and internally cohesive. Antagonisms can lead to breaks. Contradictions do not stop society from constituting a whole, a totality. Self-regulating mechanisms change, but they do not disappear, and so cyclic movements are not abolished. A process resembling a rising spiral segmented by numerous accidents encompasses the circular process, which from then on maintains a periodicity. Society as a whole continues to reproduce its relations and conditions of existence. reproduce, but the socio-economic proportions inherent to simple reproduction are modified by the proportions necessary for accumulation on an extended scale. On analysis we find that they are still present, as conditions for a dynamic equilibrium, rather as we find ancient mechanistic physics present within modern physics. If the society of economic growth did not go on reproducing its social relations, it would crumble away, but this would only happen gradually, and on a limited level, the level of the fragmented division of labor and of the conscious relations between separate individuals, and of the separation between private and public, and between the everyday, and the world as a whole, on the level of society as a whole, on the level of property and production relations, of class relations. Social cohesion continues to grow ever more strong. The economic mechanisms of self-regulation in themselves are not enough to guarantee it, and as they only come into play on a certain level, the cohesion of the whole is guaranteed in another way, on the level of a certain consciousness, by representations, ideologies, models, values, and also by new works, and finally, by the use and misuse of ancient symbolisms. This process of accumulation involves society as a whole, and the men who compose it, in a historicity. In history in the accepted sense of the term, and which Marx characterizes as natural history or the prehistory of man as a true human being. As we understand it, this history differs quite profoundly from the history affecting archaic societies. It has its specific characteristics. The process of accumulation controls it and determines its conjunctures. Unlike in ancient societies, although it was certainly important, the economic sphere becomes predominant and determining. This history is made by individuals and groups, but blindly. Trapped as they are in a deep and many-sided alienation, it is something they must endure, and so the accumulative economic process comes in tandem with a political and ideological history which is particularly linked to uneven economic development. The historical, political and social experience of recent times makes it necessary for us to continue to develop Marxist theory beyond the point Marx himself left it. To begin with, let us present several propositions. Marx conceived of socialism both as the end to the process of accumulation, and as its aim. Once this process had reached a high degree of productive investments, of productivity and production, in the highly industrialized countries, the revolutionary proletariat would take over its administration. It would not bring accumulation to an end, but would immediately orientate it towards the conscious transformation of the world. Our reinstatement of the Marxist project has already shown that Marx was concerned not so much with transforming the outside world as with metamorphosing everyday life. The alienation of the everyday as a residual deposit and a product of all the partial alienations would disappear. This prediction has not been borne out. However, from the historical moment when growth and accumulation, the level of the productive forces, made what Marx predicted possible, there was a qualitative change. This was the moment we entered into modernity and into the permanent crisis of modernity which is now permeating every sphere. B. The socialism achieved as the result of a proletarian revolution in a poorly industrialized country seems to differ somewhat from the Marxist program, but let us be prudent and optimistic. It is different until further notice. Socialism appears to be a social and political means for accelerating the process of accumulation in backward and underdeveloped countries. It corresponds to the globalization of the process, and not to the end of it. It consists not of enjoyment of what has been accomplished, but of an intensification of the accomplishment itself. The destructive character of the process, which determined European history for centuries, is becoming modified. In certain aspects it is becoming weaker, and in others more accentuated. It is remarkably obvious that the process of accumulation is speeding up. The factors of saturation and rupture which threatened it for centuries in Europe have been eliminated, but the ideological, cultural, political and human consequences of this activity entirely devoted to accumulation remain with us in a permanent state of challenge and extraordinary tension. It is to this worldwide situation, which Marx did not predict, that we owe the intensification of old forms of ideological and political alienation, and the invention of new forms of alienation, technological alienation, and total alienation of the everyday. C. The process of accumulation appears as a central axis or backbone of modern history. It is in relation to this process that historical situations are characterized and become specific. Let us indicate several of its types, when the process develops spontaneously, antedating the formation of the state, for example, England, the United States, and France, in part, when the state accompanies and stimulates the process. For example, France, in part, Germany, Italy, and Tsarist Russia, when the state organizes and accelerates the process. For example, the socialist states, and when the state antedates the process of accumulation. For example, the underdeveloped countries which have recently won their independence. As a consequence, there are remarkable historical differences in the role these states play, in how they are structured and in the way they function. This does not take other considerations into account, such as legal modalities and property relations within the state. 5. Generalization of the concept. This is not the place to study the patterns, in capital, of how reproduction on an extended scale functioned, or to give a close analysis of the historicity and diversity of the historical situations during this process, or to describe the changing historical conditions of accumulation. We know that Marx did not present these conditions in their totality and diversity. He restricted himself to England and English capitalism, as a type or an extreme case, a spontaneous process which antedated the formation of the state and subsequently minimized its role. This initial gap has never been adequately filled, and has led to some Serious misunderstandings. Some people in the Marxist movement have been too exclusive in attributing the simple requirements of industrialization to the ferocity of the bourgeoisie. We now know that no nation and no country can escape these torments. Although the modalities and the nature of the devastation may differ, we will restrict ourselves to a few comments which will allow us to present the concept of a cumulative process, or growth by accumulation, on its most extended scale. As soon as the economic historian examines the conditions of primitive accumulation in Western Europe, he will observe that there was an increase in discoveries and technical progress during the Middle Ages. This was pointed out by Marx, who did not share the opinion of evolutionist and liberal historians about the Dark Ages. Subsequently, the work of technologists and historians has extended our knowledge on this subject. When we examine this early capitalization of techniques, we discover the complexity of the historical conditions, the renewal of urban life, the recovery in commercial exchanges, the rediscovery of Greek science. The recovery of commercial exchanges was the result of improvements in agricultural techniques attributable to the arrival from the east of peoples who had hitherto been nomadic. Progress in the use of horses, harnesses, plows, crop rotation, etc. Technical progress in the Middle Ages was due to the fusion of several contributions, as much as it was to any special inventive capability. What did these contributions have in common? How can we explain the renewal of this inventive capability? It was a moment when thought was rediscovering the ability to be conceptual and abstract. Now only logic can determine a level of experience and of reflective thought which will enable concepts, abstract, mathematical, physical and biological, knowledge and techniques to be accumulated effectively and transmitted more skillfully than with using examples or day-to-day discourse. Only logic defines a coherence on a level which is above and beyond nature, empiricism and spontaneous sociability, using the rediscovery of Greek culture, and on an analogous economic base, commodity production, urban life, increased communications and exchanges, but without an unmediated or mechanical link between this base and the acquisitions it facilitated. The Middle Ages were able to redefine the form which the process of accumulation would take. Then, after having been interrupted and slowed down for many centuries, the process gained impetus, producing a veritable discontinuity in the 16th century which is inaccurately called the Renaissance. And so our idea of the process of accumulation is now much broader. Knowledge is an accumulative process, and so is technology. Taken together they presuppose the elaboration of a form and are part of the conditions of a specific process, the accumulation of capital, that is data the means of production, which begins deep within the capitalist mode of production. At first we saw the process of accumulation as something uniform, but now we are beginning to see that it is composed of several related processes. It is a sheaf, of fasces once we have distinguished between them. Its components themselves appear to be accumulative processes. Rationality, for example, has an accumulative character among these activities, which are partial processes within a comprehensive process. We may include knowledge, technology, production and productivity, that is, economics, culture in the accepted sense of the word linked to rationality and knowledge, and maybe political action, insofar as it operates from established legal and bureaucratic superstructures, which also snowball. Every process of accumulation can be represented schematically by an exponential curve, A, or E, at the fastest growth. Here this is a temporal function, at or E. This exponential growth can only be a tendency, or rather it is generally only a tendency. When of necessity the process involves factors which slow it down, more or less deep and lasting saturation, the exponential curve takes on a much more complicated form, called a logistic curve. In point of fact, we know that historical events and conjunctures can interrupt or break any process of an accumulative kind. We can use this observation to draw up a schematic of history over the last 5 centuries or so. It is doubly determined by the economic process of accumulation, which is its axis, and the conjunctures and events which propel, slow down or interrupt it. The process constitutes the determination of a historical necessity. The historical situations which appear around this central axis introduce chance, contingency and initiatives by individuals and groups. We could even use it to extrapolate a general periodization of history which would redefine their place and their role in political economy, sociology and history, as follows. First period, non-accumulative societies, predominance of agricultural production, localized crafts, barter or commerce in the pores of this society, complete or almost excess consumption of production in terms of immediate needs, slow or zero demographic growth, interrupted by regressions, plagues, famines, wars, transformations by the governing groups of living wealth, abstractly capable of being invested into dead wealth, treasure, monuments, works of art, knowledge of a frequently remarkable kind, but not accumulated, the preserve of groups of initiates, and disappearing almost completely whenever the groups themselves disappeared. High standard of art, authentic lifestyles, marked contrasts between splendor and brutality, predominance of cyclic forms of social processes and time scales, predominance of custom, which held the community together. Second period, accumulative societies, or to be more poetic, Promethean societies, initially poorly defined appearance of the process of accumulation. Its various conditions come into being independently. Transitions dart silent, bitter struggle between this process, and the men driving it forward, and the grandiose, venerable and vulnerable world of the past. Ideological delusions introduced by the struggle, the Renaissance, unleashing of the process in an increasingly violent way. Revolutionary surges, worldwide extension, substitution of cyclic time with linear time. Industrial production taking over from agriculture. Predominance of law rather than custom. Socialization of society. A third period which would begin with the transformation of everyday life, following a deliberate and conscious policy, after a long and difficult transition. Do we need to add that modernity represents this transition precisely, and that we are part of it? The term we have just used, that is, the socialization of society, requires an explanation. In the pattern we have presented, the economic and the historical spheres match each other relatively easily. With the process of accumulation, history does not simply change direction. When it loses its cyclic character, it takes on a new sense, direction and meaning. This is not to say that it loses its violent and bloody character, but rather that something new appears. The economic sphere per se becomes the base and the axis of society and of its history. What is more, the constitutive links to the old society, links of consanguinity, links with the earth, become blurred or disappear within a vaster society. The process of accumulation shatters and subordinates whatever resists it. The limits of groupings, unmediated relations, pre-existing social structures. It does not entirely suppress them, since the family persists, and within the process nationhood comes into being. By submitting to the process of accumulation, groups originally formed by consanguinity and territory become its means, its implements and its context. Society as a whole continues to consolidate and to form itself into a solid totality, or tries to. Full stop. As a totality, its influence on its elements and members becomes increasingly profound, through the policies and effectiveness of state institutions, through culture, through ideology. In this way it submits them to the requirements of accumulation, acted out, of course, according to the aims, interests and perspectives of the dominant class. But at the same time we witness the appearance and consolidation of the individual and of private life, and of individualism as ideology. During the first historical period, the individual, in so far as we can talk of individuality, was always taken care of by a community. It protected him, but also it did not hesitate to sacrifice him ruthlessly. Then, during the period of accumulation, the individual acquires a certain practical and theoretical autonomy. He exists, but then society abandons him. Either he participates in accumulation, or he is on his own. He is on his own insofar as he exists as a private person. Socially and legally, he has rights according to the law, and first and foremost the essential right to own property. This leads to a fundamental conflict between concrete reality and legal and political fictions, between theory and practice, between living and the law, between the hidden truth and the social appearance on display. Represented. Officially, society respects the individual, a respect which representations sanctify, but it is just as ready as it was in the past to turn against him. On the level of national society as a whole, the power of the state has all the necessary means at its disposal. In principle, in civilized society, the society of the process of accumulation, there is no more torture and there are no more massacres. Each individual can contribute to accumulation, of knowledge, of implements, of social capital, etc., and yet needs must, and the requirements of accumulation outweigh all else. This colossal and colossally contradictory process has a third aspect. It differentiates between groups and segregates them. From the 17th and 18th centuries onwards, across society as a whole, we see the emergence of subgroups which hitherto had been defined and merged in what subsisted of the old community: children, young people, women, intellectuals, etc. Henceforth these large groups are seen as having their particularities, aspirations and claims. Differences such as these precede, announce and accompany the great polarization into classes: bourgeoisie, proletariat, middle classes. They make phenomena more complicated and are part of the socialization of society, with all its various aspects. The more effective a cumulative society becomes as an integrating force, the more it loses control over its own elements. This society keeps its own inner contradictions alive and, surprisingly, it segregates as much as it unifies and individualizes. It emphasizes the particularities of these groups, and acts as mediator between the two aspects of singularity, the individual and generality, unity and totality on the scale of society as a whole. Social segregation is based on the division of labor, but can be reduced to it, since it implies the intervention of analytic intelligence, which shatters, separates and dichotomizes. It is also not the same as reason, which is a function of accumulation, but reason makes use of it. Analytic intelligence probably reached its crisis with the advent of the bourgeoisie and of rationalist ideology, but it was not solely their preserve, since on the theoretical and ideological level it is an element of all accumulation and of the division of labor. Analytic intelligence supplied itself actively and effectively, and the present-day social and human world is to a large extent its handiwork. From then on, analysis split up everything which could be split, until it almost ruined and, apparently, atomized the social totality. In our present-day society, everything which could be set apart, separated and autonomized has been done so. Aspects of labor, social functions, specialized activities, technology, the arts, the sciences, age groups, the sexes, classes, categories of urban inhabitants, and of course, everyday life in relation to whatever is not everyday life. So the socialization of society conceals a dialectical movement, totality, or more exactly, totalization, individualization, or personalization which had its abortive beginnings with individualism, and particularization, which becomes segregation at the hands of an extremely effective functional analysis of groupings and activities. This threefold movement encompasses a multitude of contradictions. It takes shape and emerges with the process of economic growth which conditions it, which makes it possible. On one hand it depends upon accumulation, and on the other on representations, superstructures, and a socially and practically justified function, analytic intelligence. What we have said so far only begins to explain and explore the consequences and implications of the concept of the process of accumulation. We will now draw a line under it, or otherwise it will deflect us from the task in hand. But we could take it further. For example, we could ask ourselves whether the process of accumulation, with all its elements, which are themselves partial processes, bursts forth into the world in nature like some sort of human miracle, a miracle laden with hopes and fears. Could it be born of a chance encounter between elements and factors which are mutually exclusive and with no connection other than this conjectural convergence at a given moment in history? Or could it be the continuation of a deeper necessity? We may suppose that, biologically, physiologically, life contains a tendency towards being accumulative which is immediately slowed and inhibited by opposing factors, such as saturations or obstacles. The growth of animal life is a prime example of this. Every species would flourish indefinitely if this expansion did not contain its own limits, its negation within itself. In point of fact, every species is prey to other species. What is more, as it grows, every species modifies its own environment and destroys the species it in turn preys upon. As this process develops, the human brain, or rather the cortex, also seems to be an organ capable of capitalizing experiences. It perpetuates and heightens the ability to which living substance owes both its strength and its vulnerability, the ability to retain traces of the past while struggling to maintain itself within its environment at the heart of the present and moment. The work of the Pavlovian school helps us to study the accumulative function of the brain and also to understand what hinders it. Men forget as much as they remember. The functioning of the cortex produces internal inhibitions and decelerations. The cortex is quickly saturated. Emotions disturb its accumulative but incomplete functioning. Self-regulations are never perfect and never allow for the complete capitalization of what has been acquired. The same may be said of so-called psychological functions, memory per se, perception, intelligence, and so it is as though a deeply rooted tendency within the process of accumulation, which in nature is frustrated by antagonistic factors, were emerging in man, in society, in history and in economy. Should we believe that in nature, cyclic rhythms originate in an embryonic accumulative process which returns to its point of departure? Should we go right back to the physical processes, the growth of which is expressible by geometric progressions and logarithms? Such hypotheses go far beyond our aims and our competence. 6 non-accumulative processes. The generalization we have just made of the concept of the accumulative process leads us to accept the existence of non-accumulative processes, not for the first time, but in a clearer light. They exist as causes, effects, foundations or results. Taken as a whole, the cortex, subcortical formations, the neurovegetative system, the human brain does not seem to function unilaterally, as one block. It comprises levels, differences in level, imbalances and conflicts, and much more than this. Pathology seems inherent to human perfectibility, that is, to its imperfections, gaps, memory lapses and mistakes are part of how it functions. Men can make mistakes without going off track, and can then correct them. They can go astray, get lost, and then find themselves again. They can become alienated, and then disalienated. In the future there may be highly advanced machines which will duplicate logical, discursive and reflective thought. They may even surpass it in breadth and precision. Doubtless they will never have the power to forget. Forgetting is beneficial, in that it allows us to start again, but it is also harmful, in that it involves mechanical repetitions and gaps in accumulated experience. Will these machines duplicate affectivity and its disturbances, passion, laughter, boredom, fear of dying, alienation and disalienation? This is doubtful, unless we agree with the metaphysics of science fiction, which explores what is possible by using myths from the past. Surely we must see accumulative functions in the activities of the brain, disjunctions which work on distinctions and differences, and capitalize them, as well as non-accumulative ones. This idea could lead us to reconsider Pavlovian representations, which link a number of facts together, but then transform them into a system by a way of thinking which ignores dialectical method. 8. This hypothesis leads us to scrutinize nervous activity for levels, imbalances, differences and conflicts, while not breaking its incontestable unity. Let us now move from the biological and physiological level to the psychological level in the total field we are hypothetically exploring. There is no justification for rejecting the thesis, which was robustly maintained by Marx and Engels, of a modification of human sensory, perceptive, active organs during the course of history and of the education of individuals. Surely it is impossible that labor should not have modified the eyes, the ears, the hands and the forms of sensory perception, all of which have their origins in nature. However, to what extent has it modified them? All we need is to look at the Lascaux and Altamira frescoes to realize the naivety of the evolutionism which tries to assimilate the development of the body and its organs via labor with transformations of consciousness and reflective thought via abstraction and conceptualization. These age-old works of art reveal a sensory acuteness, a perceptive vivacity and a creative power of action and gesture which 20th century man finds astonishing. He is amazed, and wonders if Picasso's greatness is not due to his having rediscovered something of the freshness of our origins through the world of abstraction. Could we go so far as to maintain that the appropriation of external nature by the senses and the body is more active at the beginning of social and individual life, with primitive hunters, and with children? We certainly can. What does labor bring to this initial layer of perceptions? A great deal. First of all, abstractions and signs, and then signals. And yet, do not these great acquisitions come with partial regressions? When the abstraction of signs, and above all of signals, is superimposed on sensory perceptions, it constitutes a world which is both external and abstract, the world of modernity which conditions individual gestures. Does this world inhibit the freshness and vivacity of the senses? It certainly does, especially if it is true that in the modern world with the perceptively efficient technology they represent, signals are characteristically accumulative. Hence, by contrast, the prestige of archaic objects, primitive arts, symbols, and the astonishment they provoke in men of the industrial era. What we are suggesting about sensory perception can also apply to emotions and affectivity. They do not appear to be accumulative, which explains the way they crystallize around paradoxically durable symbols. As we already know, most of these symbols, if not all of them, come from the distant past of agrarian and craft-based societies. Their subsequent elaboration by philosophers, dramatists and poets helped to revive them, but without modifying them to any profound degree. With their origins deep within the direct and unmediated relations between men and nature, and between men themselves, they live on in islands of unmediated private life which withstand the rising tide of relations mediated by commodities, money and technology. These symbols have become nucleuses of emotion and affectivity. When they are not used, exploited, consumed and devoured, they are attacked and concealed. When they crystallize, as the father, the mother, woman, virginity, love, the sun, the house, water, earth, air, fire, hearth and home, they degenerate, break up and scatter. They remain well outside the processes of accumulation. According to this criterion, we will classify human activities into two major types of process, accumulative and non-accumulative. Within this classification, we may discern genres or species, processes of accumulation which have been decelerated, saturated, liberated or accelerated, circular processes which have stabilized, and nucleuses which have degenerated or broken up, etc. This provides us with a starting point for an analysis of praxis and a representation of the process of human becoming. We have already drawn up a list of accumulative activities. Among non-accumulative activities we would include sensory perception, sensibility, sensuality, spontaneity, art in general, morality, subjective or deriving from custom, as distinct from objective morality which depends upon law and the state, and finally civilization in the broadest sense, as opposed to culture. The non-accumulative is also the non-rational. We use the term in its essentially relative sense, since there is no question of us positing an absolute, ontological, irrationality. We can also say that the accumulative would be related to space, while the non-accumulative would be related to time. However, there is no question of separating space from time, nor is there any question of separating the two types of process. They are permanently interactive, so that when we describe and analyze that interaction, we perceive various gaps, imbalances, differences and conflicts between levels. If our experience of modernity is of a deep-rooted and ever-increasing malaise, our concepts will enable us to discover some of its causes and aspects, and perhaps to reveal the problem in its totality. The problem in question is the problem of everyday life. Everyday life lies at the ill-defined, cutting edge where the accumulative and the non-accumulative intersect. On one hand, it must submit to the demands of accumulation, and suffer its effects and consequences. It exists on the level of the most pressing conditions and effects of the process of accumulation, cohesion, logic, language and, last but not least, signals. On the other hand, it sees itself increasingly distanced by the process, which becomes dissociated in the giddy heights of specializations and technology. In itself, it remains linked to rhythms, to cyclic time scales and to symbols. This is merely putting what we have already said in another way. The everyday is situated at the boundary between the controlled sector, that is, the sector controlled by knowledge, and the uncontrolled sector. This is ill-defined and dangerous border territory, particularly because its symbols give the illusory impression of controlling spontaneous nature, while the techniques which really do control it are increasingly hidden from view. The malaise comes primarily from the extraordinary imbalance between the symbolic nucleuses and the acquisitions of abstract knowledge and technology, that is, from the conflictual relation between the two processes. This imbalance itself has various aspects and various senses. The affective nucleuses are survivals, in inverted commas. There can be no survivals without base or foundation. From a certain point of view, they seem more beautiful, more precious and more immediate than all the accumulations of experience and knowledge put together. From another rigorously equivalent and equally well-founded point of view, they are old-fashioned, ridiculous and backward. Similarly, from yet another point of view, the accumulative is the only truth over and above the real. It alone is important, great and creative, while the everyday knows itself to be negligible, superficial and non-essential. But another equally acceptable point of view would be that the everyday is the only thing which matters to mankind. In themselves, symbols are only maintained by means of metaphorical language, words or the use of rather unusual words, literary or historical recollections, objects infused with meaning, and works of art. Their only bases are are their uncertain and private social relations with nature, with the other and with the self. The vast tide of modernity is sweeping these supports away. Economic backwardness and underdevelopment, villages, the mountains, the sea, picturesque tourist attractions, barren regions, etc. feed these survivals and maintain these nucleuses without breathing any new life into them. It is as though cyclic time scales have been ripped asunder by the linear time of the process of accumulation and have been left to hang in tatters within us and around us. And yet symbolisms, cyclic rhythms and the shattered or degenerate nucleuses continue to organize the everyday. They represent its stable center and maintain the illusion of a preordained harmony, if indeed we can still use that word. The result is an incessant tension, and thus the possibility of sterile conflicts and pathological deviations, both in individual consciousness and in social consciousness, reduced to silence amid all the verbiage and verbalisms, relegated to an obscurity which prompts us to speak of unconsciousness. Private everyday life is built up around symbols which are constantly discredited by public life, economic and political praxis, signs, signals and significations. All that personal life has at its disposal to make itself into a conscious creative endeavor, and to give itself a conscious history, are these nucleuses buried within the deep secrecy of individual psychophysiological life, tastes and desires, amorous, erotic, affective, alimentary, etc., or rather, the absence of tastes and desires. This is how public life, overtly subjected to accumulative processes, overwhelms private life, condemning it to powerlessness, unconsciousness and dissatisfaction. When it tries to become reconciled with private life, things are even worse. It invades it and absorbs it, cf. the mass media. In every case, everyday life is forsaken territory, an island of tears and tedium where man as the norm is normally cast away, the frontier between the controlled sector, controlled by knowledge and technology, and therefore by and in accumulation, and the uncontrolled sector is a no man's land where everyone lies more or less on the level of deteriorated and shattered spontaneity. The more people speak of adaptation, balance and harmony, the less real harmony, balance and adaptation there is. And what do obsessions mean if not that even these conflicts are no longer created within the individual, and at the heart of his consciousness and his ill-appropriated life, two processes are apparent equals the rational and the irrational, the relatively conscious and the relatively unconscious. On one hand, if he cannot accumulate money, he accumulates experiences, and if he cannot accumulate capital, he accumulates knowledge. Even if they are fragmented, experience and knowledge join together to form a memory. On the other hand, there is something inside him which is ever more distant, ever more vulnerable, something he is consciously seeking, the childhood and the spontaneity which are as much a part of symbolisms as they are of memory. Is this not one of the secrets of the disturbed drama of modern life? This uneasy, private consciousness which is increasingly penetrated by the general process and is forced to conform to it, and yet which is becoming increasingly private and trapped within the everyday. In fact, as soon as radical critique unmasks the situation in which consciousness and life are trapped, it seems intolerable, and we ask ourselves why the devastation is not even more destructive than it is. 7. The pedagogic and culturalist illusion. We must find a way out of this situation. How? By revolutionary praxis reconstructed in its totality. But what else? By following technology to its bitter end in order to reinvest it in an everyday life which has been metamorphosed, instead of merely observing the terrifying discrepancy between the two. By discovering new representations of time and imposing them. By persuasion on time as we usually live it. By raising the everyday to the level of technology and by reinvesting technology in the everyday. By eradicating the old symbolisms and creating new ones. New images of life as a work of creativity. But this is to jump the gun. Let us begin by closing off the false exits. In the modern world, pedagogic and cultural fictions have joined forces with the old legal, ideological and political fictions. The citizen, everyone is equal before the law, etc. The new fiction sees a baton when the old ones are too weak to stay in the race. What do they consist of? The attribution of the accumulative character to sensibility, emotivity and affectivity. Therefore it is considered possible to form them in the same way as conceptual or technical knowledge through the accumulation of experiences, facts or representations. And despite all the failures of fiction both in the individual and on the scale of society as a whole, it is obviously in the domain of art that this illusion and its consequences may be best observed. What is known about art grows in an accumulative way. The number of objects piled up in the Universal Museum and in the total library of books, records and films must increase exponentially. The viewer and the listener has increasingly easier and more frequent access to all works from all ages. It is assumed that when the various sources of knowledge are all bundled together in this way it will stimulate our powers of creativity, or even that technologies and the last to be developed is always the best, will be a substitute for spontaneity. The two poles of activity, technological literacy and creative power would merge. Not so the welter of works, of knowledge and of technology comes in tandem with a gargantuan consumption which must surely be looting and devouring all the riches of ages which precisely did not accumulate, and which have left us their treasures in trust. The result is an astonishing sociological phenomenon, aestheticism, which is not caused and explained by its accumulative character alone, and its corollary, the permanent crisis of so-called modern art. Insofar as there is such a thing as creativity, does it not come from a direct or indirect appeal to the symbolisms and the myths which supported it in times past, and from an effort to reinstate spontaneity in the face of the clutter of abstract culture and pedagogically cultivated consciousness? But nothing will spare symbolisms their inevitable dissolution. They too have already been relegated to the aberrant margins of culture, astrology and parascientific interpretations of science, science fiction, specific worlds, of women and of children, petty superstitions and ritualizations, and works of which it is impossible to say whether they are foretelling the future or falling into decrepitude at the very moment of their success. The same is true of the moral sphere. Knowledge of morality, its history and its values is expanding. Like discourse on aesthetics, discourse on morality and its values is becoming increasingly facile. Ethics is a loser, and it will never be possible to extrapolate a practical lifestyle from moral knowledge, and so the malaise of the everyday and of the privation of private life is contaminating the higher spheres of art, ethics, creativity and the understanding between consciousnesses. The theory of moment one typology of repetition. Previously we underlined the differences between several forms or types of repetition, which were mutually irreducible. Repetition of cycles and cyclic rhythms differs from repetition of mechanical gestures. The first of these types belongs to the non-accumulative processes, which have their own time scales, while the second belongs to the processes of accumulation, with their linear time scales, which are now continuous, now discontinuous. Repetition of behavior patterns, conditionings, stimulated by signals cannot be assimilated to repetition of states, emotions or attitudes linked to symbols and emotional nucleuses. We must distinguish between repetition of situations, notably in pathological cases, and repetition postulated by certain systems, by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. For example, if repetition, return or renewal of the same, or more or less the same phenomenon should be understood according to each specific case and type, the same can be said of the relation between what is repeated and the newness which springs from repetition. For example, repetition of sounds and rhythms in music offers a perpetual movement which is perpetually reinvented. Similarly, repetition of the instant, so frequently studied by philosophers, the hic et nunc, pure immediacy, the purely transitory in perception and the lived, cannot be assimilated to repetition of the moment. Two moments in language as regards the term moment. Our first comment would be that it corresponds to the sense, expression plus signification direction of a given word in general and common usage, or, if you prefer, to its lived content. Let us take the word love, which crops up so frequently in language. To what does it correspond? Is there a higher entity which is indicated by the word and which endows it with a general sense because it subordinates a set of situations and emotional or affective states? This classic Platonizing and rationalist theory is not tenable, and yet, if there is not a unified set of so-called love situations and states, the word itself has no meaning. Could it be simply the abstract connotation of a range of states and situations with no concrete links between them? In this case, not only are there loves, as opposed to a few types of love, but an indefinite number of them, amorphous and multifarious. This equally classic, empiricist and skeptical theory is just as untenable. As we well know, it presents a challenge to language, it undermines and disintegrates it. Words are no more than arbitrary signs, and discourse is no more than a formal construction. But discourse is linked to praxis, a level of experience, and it has meaning because it has both a logical, disjunctive, form and an emotional and affective content, which it efficiently transmits. We understand it through its form and structure, but not only that. Communication presupposes all the levels, and all the tensions and conflicts between those levels. Never complete, rarely real. It implies that the semantic field is neither opaque and solid like a stone, nor unstable like mist. It implies relative movement and relative stabilities. Why do the same words come back time and time again, with their images and symbols? And how do they make themselves understood? What is it that allows us to use the word love in varying situations and conversations, and still be understood by the different people we are talking to? What is it that creates a certain alignment between the emotion expressed by one speaker and the emotion aroused in the other, just by the use of one word? When people are in love, or imagine they are, when they hate each other, or imagine they do, what is it that allows them to communicate what they are feeling or what they are not feeling, to recognize one another, to create misunderstandings and resolve them, up to a point, to rise above insinuation or silence, in short to avoid a dialogue of the deaf which would be no more than the sum total of two soliloquies, in which case language would be devoid of meaning, that is, of effectiveness, and would inevitably waste away or would even have long since disappeared. Through all the changes, something remains. We would say that something is the moment. Psychological terms, such as states, emotions, attitudes, behavior patterns, etc., do not adequately define it, since it implies a twofold recognition of otherness, or rather, of the other and of the self. This recognition, which joins forces in an original dramatic situation with what is known and what is unknown, explains and justifies the use of the word. It presupposes in turn the confused or clear perception of an analogy and a difference in lived time, that is, a specific modality of repetition. Something which is certainly not a thing is encountered once again, both an illusion and a reality. Lived time appears once more through all the veils and distances. It vanishes, and at the same time it makes itself known. No specifically sociological or historical determination can adequately define this temporality. The theory of moments comes initially from an effort to give language significance and value, in the face of its critics, such as Bergson, and in spite of the undermining and disintegration of language which we are currently witnessing. It is the product of a violent protest against Bergsonism and the former psychological continuum advocated by Bergsonian philosophy. Its wish is to reinstate discontinuity, grasping it in the very fabric of the lived, and on the loom of continuity, which it presupposes, and consequently without making it abstract, and without merging it with the arbitrary in the purely formal, which is a reaction against exaggerated continuism, though not a supersession of it. According to this process, we do not start from logos, discourse and language. We come to it, time and time again. The theory does not postulate the value or the substantial reality of language. It does not take logos as an axis of reference. On the contrary, it tries to reinstate language in all its power, by understanding, by knowing, certain conditions under which it can be fully exercised, seeing it theoretically undermined by the attacks of some philosophers and poets, and practically, socially, undermined by signals, audio-visual imageries, jargons and by the isolation of minds incapable of communicating. It starts from an analysis of the conditions for communication. If it were too perfect, language would be of little use to communication. Or rather, it would change it into a communion of angelic and disembodied minds. Supposing that means anything, everything would be instantly clear. Such magic transparency has not even the beauty of a dream. It implies a lack of depths, levels and planes, in life as it is lived. If it were too imperfect, language would fail to cope with differences. It would leave them to their own opaqueness. As it is, with its mobile complexity which is nevertheless structured by constants, nucleuses and moments, language is of use to us. It is a good implement, and something more than just an implement. More profoundly perhaps, the theory derives from a need to organize, program and structure everyday life by transforming it according to its own tendencies and laws. It wishes to perceive the possibilities of everyday life and to give human beings a constitution by constituting their powers, if only as guidelines or suggestions. This means that we are using the term moment in a rather particular way, while still insisting on its day-to-day usage, and on the fact that certain words in common usage have a general, definable quality or property. In day-to-day language, the word moment and the word instant are almost interchangeable. However, there is a distinction between them. When we say LT was an enjoyable moment, for example, it implies a certain length of time, a value, a nostalgia and the hope of reliving that moment or preserving it as a privileged lapse of time, embalmed in memory. It is not just any old instant, nor a simple ephemeral and transitory one. In the Hegelian system, the term moment receives special treatment. It designates the major figures of consciousness, each of them, the consciousness of the master and that of the slave in their mutual relations, the stoicist or skeptical consciousness, the unhappy consciousness, etc., is a moment in the dialectical ascent of self-consciousness. Even more essentially, dialectical movement marks the turning point of reality and of the concept, the fundamental intervention of the negative which leads to disalienation but also to renewed alienation, to supersession through negation of negation, but also to new stages in the process of becoming into new figures of consciousness. The Hegelian notion seems to have influenced day-to-day language. Did anyone talk about the historical moment before Hegel? Definitely not. Our use of the term will be more modest than Hegel's, but broader. We situate the moment as a function of a history, the history of the individual. We consider that up to a certain point, very limited, and as yet, too limited. This history is his own creative undertaking, and that he recognizes himself within it, even if it is in a confused way. Moreover, the history of the individual in his everyday life cannot be separated from the social sphere. Narrow and limited though it is part of other, broader works. However, the theory of moments parenthesizes these implications. Like all theories, it uses a justified abstraction to isolate its object. Moreover, it examines the moment in general, and particular moments in their relation with everyday life. Thus it does not presume to define them completely or exhaust them. There are other sciences and methods which could study these moments. The moment is a higher form of repetition, renewal and reappearance, and of the recognition of certain determinable relations with otherness, or the other, and with the self. Compared with this relatively privileged form of repetition, the others would be nothing more than raw materials, namely the succession of instants, gestures and behavior, constant states which reappear after being interrupted or suspended, objects or works, and finally, symbols and affective stereotypes. 3. The constellation of moments among moments. We may include love, play, rest, knowledge, etc. We cannot draw up a complete list of them, because there is nothing to prevent the invention of new moments. How and why should we classify any particular activity or state as a moment? What should our indexes and criteria be? The moment is constituted by a choice which singles it out and separates it from a muddle or a confusion. That is, from an initial ambiguity. Natural and spontaneous animal or human life offers nothing but ambiguity. The same is true for the amorphous muddle we know as the everyday in all its triviality, where analysis discerns the detritus and the seeds of every possibility. Moments are there in embryonic form, but it is difficult to make them out with any clarity, and so it is in childhood and adolescence, in games and in work, in playing and in loving. If we are to particularize work, for example, be it of a material or intellectual nature, and if we are to specify the entire set of attitudes, behavior patterns and gestures it groups together, we will need a very strict pedagogy and a great deal of effort. In a similar way, amorous playfulness, light-hearted chat, flirtation, teasing conversations, provocation comes before love itself. Difficult to pick out in all this equivocal and muddled ambiguity. The one emerges very slowly from the other, and sometimes not at all, until such time as we can distinguish between love and playfulness. There can be no love, or love can be no more. Love has its serious side if it plays games. It dominates them. In this sense, love implies the project of love, of loving and of being loved. It chooses to constitute its moment. It begins with an attempt at a moment and with the temptation of the moment, disturbing and frequently refused. B. The moment has a certain specific duration, relatively durable. It stands out from the continuum of transitories within the amorphous realm of the psyche. It wants to endure, it cannot endure. At least not for very long. Yet this inner contradiction gives it its intensity, which reaches crisis point when the inevitability of its own demise becomes fully apparent. The manner of its duration means that it cannot be brought into harmony with continuous evolution, or with pure discontinuity, a sudden mutation or revolution. It can only be defined as involution dat essentially present, an essential modality of presence. The moment has a beginning, a fulfillment and an end, a relatively well-defined start and finish. It has a history, its own, and so love is one particular love, the love of one man for one woman, or of one woman for one man, and it is also the succession of loves of one man or one woman, and a series of amorous passions in a broader history, the history of a family, of a group, of society, and finally, of the human being. The term moment will be like a digest of all the analogies and differences involved. C. The moment as its memory. For the individual and for groups, memory in love is not the same as memory in knowledge or in play. When we enter the moment, we call upon a particularized memory, which does not exclude other memories completely, but relegates them to a background of misconsciousness where they are disregarded. It is within this specific memory that the recognition of the moment and its implications are created. D. The moment as its content. It draws it from conjunctures in more or less external circumstances, and incorporates it. All the content of moments comes from everyday life, and yet every moment emerges from the everyday life in which it gathers its materials or the material it needs. The originality of the moment comes partly and only partly from its circumstantial content. Rather than tearing it, it weaves itself into the fabric of the everyday, and transforms it, partially and momentarily, like art, like the figure in a carpet. In this way it uses something that is not, something happening close by, something contingent and accidental with its circumstantial contingencies, and while it lasts, the moment also has the urgency of a command and a necessity. So someone who makes up a game for children or for adults will use whatever he happens to have at hand, or on his lips. When there is nothing else available, he will play with words. E. Equally, the moment as its form, the rules of the game, the ceremonies of love, its figures and rituals, and its symbolism, the pace and principles of work for whoever is working, etc. This form imposes itself in time and in space. It creates a time and a space which are both objective, socially governed, and subjective, individual and interindividual. In this sense, the moment not only has a form, it is this form and this order imposed on its content. F. Every moment becomes an absolute. It can establish itself as an absolute. It is even a duty for it to do so. Now we cannot conceive of the absolute, let alone live it. Therefore the moment proposes itself as the impossible. Here we are coming close to fundamental criteria. What love worthy of the name does not want to be unique and total, an impossible love? If someone has not wanted this, if he has not refused to compromise from the moment he fell in love, if he has not dreamed of the absolute, if he does not aspire to fulfill this dream, to be the first man to do so, and to achieve this fulfillment, to be the first man, the only one to do so, then he is not worthy to be called a lover. By analogy, play makes players and the player turns his game into an absolute, the aim, the meaning of life. He gambles everything which is not part of the game. It is a wager for random winnings for the heady thrill of chance. His entire life becomes a stack of chips on the gambling table. Whoever wants knowledge sacrifices everything, which is not knowledge in the pursuit of knowledge. Everything becomes an object of knowledge and a means of knowing the object it is pursuing. The moment is passion and the inexorable destruction and self-destruction of that passion. The moment is an impossible possibility, aimed at, desired and chosen as such. Then what is impossible in the everyday becomes what is possible, even the rule of impossibility. And this is when the possible-impossible dialectical movement begins, with all the consequences it entails. G. Disalienating in relation to the triviality of everyday life deep in which it is formed, but from which it emerges, and in relation to the fragmented activities it rises above, the moment becomes alienation. Precisely because it proclaims itself to be an absolute, it provokes and defines a determined alienation, the madness, not pathological, but often verging on delirium, of the lover, the gambler, the man of theory devoted to pure knowledge, the obsessive worker, etc. This specific alienation can be classified as one of a more general type, the alienation which threatens every activity within the very process of its accomplishment. Insofar as it is alienating and alienated, the moment has its specific negativity. It is destined to fail. It runs headlong towards failure. Everything happens as if he, the man who has changed his passion into a world, wanted to fail. Negativity operates at the heart of whatever tries to structure and constitute itself into a definitive whole, and to come to a halt. Inevitably, necessity and chance are destined to come together and to be superseded, and from that supersession the tragic is born. In our view, the link between the tragic and the everyday is profound. The tragic takes shape within the everyday, comes into being in the everyday, and always returns to the everyday, the tragic initial decision, which constitutes an absolute, and proclaims it, the tragedy of heartbreak, of alienation, of failure at the heart of fulfillment, of the return to the everyday to start the process all over again. This is how the contradiction between triviality and tragedy is determined, and we are bold enough to say that it can be overcome, and that the theory of moments gives a glimpse of its supersession. We imagine so called spiritual life to be like a constellation, and this is a symbol we will deliberately use. In the light, or the half-light, of the everyday, the constellation of moments cannot be seen, but when something disturbing casts a shadow on the everyday, the constellation rises on the horizon. We each of us choose our star, freely, but with the impression of an irresistible inner necessity. No one is forced to choose. There is no astrological explanation for the constellation of moments. Freedom has no horoscope. In this day and age, everyday life is lit by false suns, morality, the state, ideology. They bathe it in a ferny light, and even worse, they lower it to depths where Possibilities cannot be perceived, and keep it there. Sadly, the stars of what is possible shine only at night. Sooner or later the everyday must dawn, and the suns must rise to their zenith, including the black sun of empty anguish. Until such time as mankind has transformed this light and this darkness, stars will shine only at night. So-called spiritual life offers several different absolutes, several paths towards totalization, several paths towards fulfillment. In other words, towards failure. This is how things are, and until things changed out, mankind can do nothing about it. If a man wants to be a man, this is how he will create himself, moving ahead as far as he can on one of these paths. Spiritually speaking, he is in a configurative space, with its given dimensions. However, this mathematical metaphor hides the truth, the freedom which dawns even in the inevitability of tragedy and the need for tragedy. None of us can escape this drama. Saint's absence of tragedy itself creates yet another dramatic situation. The desolation of everyday life, emptiness and ennui, and the moment, it is an individual and freely celebrated festival, a tragic festival, and therefore a genuine festival. The aim is not to let festivals die out or disappear beneath all that is prosaic in the world. It is to unite festival with everyday life. For definition of the moment, we will call moment the attempt to achieve the total realization of a possibility. Possibility offers itself, and it reveals itself. It is determined and consequently it is limited and partial. Therefore to wish to live it as a totality is to exhaust it as well as to fulfill it. The moment wants to be freely total. It exhausts itself in the act of being lived. Every realization as a totality implies a constitutive action, an inaugural act. Simultaneously, this act singles out a meaning, and creates that meaning. It sets up a structuring against the uncertain and transitory background of the everyday and reveals it to be as such, uncertain and transitory, whereas before it appeared to be solidly and undoubtedly real. Could this definition, which refuses to separate fact from value, with all the false problems that would create, be philosophical? Yes and no. Could it be an ontology? In one sense, yes, and yet the being which is only revealed in what is possible does not correspond to the being given behind the actual or within the actual as posited by classic ontology. The theory uses concepts and categories elaborated by philosophy, but outside of any system and any attempt at systematization. It uses them prudently, hypothetically, while consciously accepting a certain risk. It applies them to praxis, to everyday life, to individual man's relation with nature, society and self. The theory has no desire to be exclusive. In no respect does it rule out other theories or other perspectives. Ipso facto, it attempts to open an investigation which would no longer be strictly comparable with classic philosophy, but which would nevertheless continue it. It conceives of a kind of twofold critical and totalizing experience, and of a programmatic which would not be reduced to a dogmatism or a pure problematic, the uniting of the moment and the everyday, of poetry and all that is prosaic in the world. In short, of festival and ordinary life, on a higher plane than anything which has hitherto been accomplished. This theory does not fit into any philosophical category, and the same can be said of the theory of the semantic field. Could it be an existentialism? Yes, since it describes and analyzes forms of existence. And no, since we could also say that it is essentialist. It comprises a critique of existentialism and essentialism. We could say that moments are just as much essences as they are attributes and modalities of being, or existential experiences. Furthermore, we would be happier talking about powers rather than essences, while making sure to remember that the theory has a practical goal, to transform these powers, these partial totalities which are destined to fail, into something unforeseen and new, something genuinely total, which would overcome the triviality, tragedy, contradiction. Similarly, the description of the lived in the theory of moments could be baptized as phenomenological. However, we have been very wary in our use of parenthesizing, so as to be sure to reinstate anything which we may have momentarily eliminated, and to avoid reducing the totality of the experience. Our descriptions and analysis were directed at praxis, and not at consciousness per se. We are dealing not with domains or regions, but with possibilities. To conclude, let us say that we are determining structure of possibilities and projects, while avoiding any structuralism by which actions could be predetermined. In fact, in this day and age, there is a very widespread philosophism which sees philosophy everywhere and nowhere, and forces it into insignificance. We will have nothing to do with it, nor with the ontological presumption or the illusion of the most general and the most nondescript object. If we must fit the theory of moments into some kind of classification, we will say that it has a contribution to make to an anthropology, but with two provisos. First, that we do not confuse this anthropology with a culturalism, the cultural definition of man outside of nature and spontaneity. And second, that we do not omit radical critique of all specializations, including anthropology. The latter obeys a general rule which we have already formulated axiomatically. In the domain of the social sciences, there can be no knowledge without a twofold critique. First, of the reality which must be overcome. Second, of the knowledge already acquired, along with the conceptual implements necessary for the acquisition of further knowledge. And in the case of anthropology, surely the danger of making dogmatic statements, which would offer a limited and limiting definition of man, is greater than it is elsewhere, and surely its consequences would be much more serious, in any event. All these considerations are only of marginal importance. What we need is a precise definition which will allow us to develop our analysis of moments. 5. On analytics of moments. So each moment can be characterized in the following way. ways, it is perceived, situated and distanced, and is just as much in relation to another moment as in relation to the everyday. However, the relation of the moment to the everyday cannot be determined by externality alone. The moment is born of the everyday and within the everyday. From here it draws its nourishment and its substance, and this is the only way it can deny the everyday. It is in the everyday that a possibility becomes apparent, be it play, work or love, etc., in all its brute spontaneity and ambiguity. It is equally in the everyday that the inaugural decision is made by which the moment begins and opens out. This decision perceives a possibility, chooses it from among other possibilities, takes it in charge and becomes committed to it unreservedly. This choice is already a dramatic one. At the crucial point of decision, at the heart of the everyday, nothing is clear. How can we expect something which is blatantly relative and, even worse, ambiguous, to be absolute? What is possible and what is impossible are not yet part of the conflict. They are merged. There are no exact, predetermined limits which would enable a decision on what is possible and what is impossible. Once the choice has been made, we see that the subject wishes something which is impossible in terms of the everyday, but the fact of making a decision changes what was a distant impossibility into an imminent possibility. For the passionate feeling which has now been aroused, what is impossible is precisely a criterion for possibility. It wants the impossible. It risks the possible to attain an impossible which at first seemed beyond the bounds of risk and chance. Effectively, when a decision is made, it pushes back the boundaries of impossibility. In this sense, decision assumes the risk of failure completely, but it runs another risk for which it takes full and free responsibility, with the obscure but deep-rooted idea that by chance or by willpower it will avoid it, and that is the risk of terminal failure, when the moment's magnificent trajectory will be brought to an end. Decision refuses the initial failure, whereby the attempt is aborted and caricatured. So in the moment, the instant of greatest importance is the instant of failure. The drama is situated within that instant of failure. It is the emergence from the everyday or collapse on failing to emerge. It is a caricature or a tragedy, a successful festival or a dubious ceremony, insofar as it is inherent to the moment, to its goal, to its madness and its grandeur. Failure must be considered as terminus ad quem and not as terminus a quo. If we are to understand and make a judgment, we must start not from the failure itself, but from the endeavor which leads to it. If there is a rise and a fall, a beginning and an end, the tragic is omnipresent in the genuine moment. Its fulfillment is its loss. Once again we are faced with the dialectical movement of totalization, negativity or alienation, desalination, realienation. The moment is not exactly the same as a situation. The result of a decision and a choice, of an endeavor. The moment creates situations, because it effectively links them together. In its capacity as a general term, it sums them up and condenses them. From then on they are no longer experienced in lived banality, but are taken in charge of the heart of living. We can attempt to define the relation between the moment and the situation by starting with the difference between conjuncture and structure. The conjuncture is almost the situation, and the moment is almost the structure. However, in a conjuncture, there is less than the situation, and in the moment there is more than a structure. The conscious being in situation is prey to an external conjuncture into which he must insert himself. As soon he attempts a moment, he is deliberately turning his situation into a risk, a series which from the start necessarily involves articulations in time and space, an order and a form imposed on the elements which have been taken from the conjuncture, and this is what properly and specifically constitutes the situation. Once more we are faced with the concept of the articulated, in a process of becoming, tending towards a specific end outside the general process of becoming, and constituted by a form which has been freely developed. It is a possibility which has been taken over and which will give a particularly intense and lived present moment. It will initially take a form which is as yet deprived of content. For example, ceremony, ritual, rules of the game, principles of the activity, etc. Decision gives this form its content, and this in turn creates a situation. The moment commences and recommences. It takes up the previous moment again. The same moment reinvests its form and continues it after an interruption. This is the form in which it unfolds. Ritual, ceremony and necessary succession. Thus moments lend themselves to formalisms, of love, of play, etc. But if ever formalism triumphs, the moment will have disappeared. When the moment comes to an end, there is a break. In this sense, the theory of moments rejects both ambiguity and all philosophies of ambiguity, and formalisms and all ideologies of pure form, while reserving a place for them. Like time, the moment reorganizes surrounding space. Affective space, a space inhabited by symbols which have been retained and changed into adopted themes. By love, by play, by knowledge, etc. The space of the moment, like time, is closed off by constitutive decisions. Anything which cannot be included is chased away. Could contemplation be a moment? This can be argued for and against. There are a number of philosophical systems which imply that it is, or posited as such. Perhaps all philosophy is an attempt to make contemplation a moment. If this is so, we could define philosophy as the deliberate structuring of the lived within contemplation, which it invests with value and factuality, spontaneity and culture. As we know only too well, a definition such as this renders philosophy unviable. Do moments die? Probably, if so, dark contemplation would be a dead moment. As for the look, it is certainly not a moment. To constitute oneself as pure glance, to attempt the glance as a moment, to look with clear-sightedness, but at what at everyday life, and first and foremost the everyday life of other people, is obviously tempting. since it is a practical and social fact, involving an important sensory organ and a form. Looking seems capable of such an undertaking. Since the sex organ is capable of adventure, why not the eyes? Once the decision is taken, we become pure look, clear and clear-sighted, clairvoyant and ver. We draw strength and interest from the fact that we are outside what interests people in their everyday lives. This is doomed to fail from the outset, but this time the failure is not tragic, it is comic. The pure, disembodied glance which is so perceptive that it penetrates, or thinks it penetrates, the flesh of other people is one of the great comedies of our age. Penetrating and perceptive subjectively, this glance is an objective feature of a world where everything becomes a spectacle for everyone, without any living participation. But the pure glance is unaware of this situation. Its own blindness condemns it. It seems that in contemporary philosophy there is a perpetual and ever ambiguous seesawing between looking and knowing. Such an ambiguous mixture of effective knowledge and pure glance seems unstable, untenable and unbearable. In the period when philosophy is withering away, could not philosophy be the beautiful soul of modern times, with its various oscillations and compensations? This seesawing movement between looking and knowing caricatures ancient contemplation, which lived and died. Looking cannot hope to constitute or found a moment. It destroys itself from the outset, and its possibility is sheer illusion. We will not even ask whether fatherhood, motherhood, friendship, decency, etc. can constitute moments. These are virtues and qualities which can encourage endeavors and situations. As in the case of the pure glance, the endeavor collapses before it even starts, and sometimes even more ridiculously, and so there is not an unlimited or indefinite number of moments. At the same time, we cannot wish the list of moments to be exhaustive. Were we able to complete it, we would be changing the theory into a system. Moments are mortal too, and as such, they are born, they live and they pass away. There is room not only for freedom, a limited freedom, but a real one, which comes into being by structuring, destructuring or restructuring everyday life, but for inventiveness and discovery. In this day and age we are witnessing the formation of a moment, rest, with many ambiguities, non-work, leisure, and many ideologies and techniques, such as relaxation, or autogenic training. Modern man, because he needs to, is making an effort to live rest as a totality in itself, that is, as a moment. Up until now, very little distinction used to be made between rest on the one hand and play in everyday life outside work on the other. We can define justice both as a virtue and as an institution. We could see it as a moment if we were to restrict or broaden the concept to encompass what happens in the everyday and an individual consciousness, the consciousness of the social individual. The moment is constituted by the possibility of an act. In this case, the act of judgment. It is an action which never stops. We are always making judgments, and these judgments are always bad. We know they are, and we know that they are prejudiced and unsafe, and even that we have no right to make them in the first place. In practical terms, this act is thus both possible and impossible, and we try to live it as a totality. Since it takes its elements from everyday life, and since it tries to assess it, it does not accept it purely and simply for what it is, and so a ritual is proclaimed, a ceremony, that is, a formed art, and in extreme cases a formalism. Whoever judges, in other words, whoever wishes to judge, summons actions and events, from his own life and from the life of others, into which he enters to an unwarranted degree. His mind becomes ritualized, and it dons the regalia of the courtroom. The bill of indictment presents passions and past deeds to the court as proof in these criminal proceedings. Whoever is sitting in judgment has granted himself the power to do so. Self-appointed, he summons the witnesses. He conducts the prosecution, that is, he investigates the circumstances and the motivation of actions, and usually loses track of them. He hears the evidence of the various witnesses. Finally, he gives his verdict. He passes judgment, but it never does so without appealing to higher authorities which do not exist. Since he alone has decided to pass judgment, it is easy to notice the similarity between the inner ceremony of the virtuous mind and the highly externalized formalism of justice as an institution. And so the virtue or institution dilemma is a false one, and the theory of moments resolves it. The theory allows us to understand how and why justice becomes an absolute from the moment it is conceived. Whoever loves justice and wants justice, a just man wants nothing but justice, and he judges everything according to justice, and yet he never manages to define it, let alone realize it. He determines justice according to what is just, and what is just according to justice. In this way he lapses into a specific alienation, the alienation of the moral consciousness which aspires to be absolute. To put it another way, justice as the goal of action, and philosophers fix this goal for the worthiest actions of mankind, presupposes an action which goes far beyond that goal and which is inspired by other motives. Justice cannot be realized, or even begin to be realized, by its own powers alone. Its realization implies its suppression and its supersession. Therefore the moment of justice has its alienation and its own negativity. It refers us to the supreme judge who would justify justice and realize it, who is always evoked and always absent. He maintains the powerful and beautiful image of the last judgment, which would also be the moment when the world is destroyed. Perit mundus, fiat justitia. Once we begin to judge, we never stop. How can we not judge? And yet, judge not lest ye be judged. Only the final, supreme judge, the ultimate authority, has the right to judge, like an ever-sought and ever inaccessible absolute. The moment of justice obsesses our era. Hence the fixation with trials, which is such a feature of contemporary art in Kafka, Brecht, and quite a number number of films, etc. We will return to the problem, but for the time being we will not include art or any activity which creates aesthetic works among moments. Provisionally, we will reserve the term for those activities which are undertaken in the lived and which do not produce an external object. 6 moments in the everyday. We have still not isolated and defined this relation completely. Moments make a critique by their actions of everyday life, and the everyday makes a critique by its factuality of paroxysmal moments. We have not yet exhausted this reciprocity. The moment cannot be defined by the everyday or within it, but nor can it be defined by what is exceptional and external to the everyday. It gives the everyday a certain shape, but taken per se and extrapolated from that context. This shape is empty. The moment imposes an order on the chaos of ambiguity, but taken per se this order is ineffectual and pointless. The moment does not appear simply anywhere, at just any time. It is a festival, it is a marvel, but it is not a miracle. It has its motives, and without those motives it will not intervene in the everyday. Festival only makes sense when its brilliance lights up the sad hinterland of everyday dullness, and when it uses up, in one single moment, all it has patiently and soberly accumulated, and so the everyday cannot be reduced to empty moments, even though it is unable to grasp the exciting risks moments propose. Everyday life is a level within totality, and for this reason it is denied totality, and it is unable to comprehend actions which unfold as totalities. They place themselves apart from everyday life, or rather, they try to live apart, and this is precisely how they miscarry, in all their splendor. Thus moments present themselves as duplicates of everyday life, magnified to tragic dimensions. In this way, by critique we can understand Lucas's well-known statements about the anarchy and the chiaroscuro of everyday life, or Husserl's comments on Heraclitian flux and the formlessness of the lived, while nevertheless avoiding privileging art or philosophy. There are men who are not artists and not philosophers, but who nevertheless emerge above the everyday, in their own everyday lives, because they experience moments, love, work, play, etc. All that spontaneous life can offer is muddle and confusion, knowledge, action, play or love. The man of culture tends to single out the elements or formants from what is given as a mixture of spontaneous vitality, and to use them to constitute moments. Furthermore, he tends to unify what is given to spontaneous consciousness as discrete elements, life and death, vitality and the tragedy of failure. Thus, according to the theory of moments, culture does not detach itself from nature, nor does it superimpose itself upon it. Culture selects, it makes distinctions, sometimes in an exaggerated way, separating and isolating the elements it wishes to use to such a degree that any further development becomes impossible, and then it unifies. It is in everyday life that this painstaking labor of selection and unification unfolds. Everyday life is the native soil in which the moment germinates and takes root. Nature appears to us like a gigantic wastage of beings and forms, like a frenzy of creation and destruction, outrageously playful, immeasurably tragic. Its failures, monstrosities, abortions and successes are incalculable. And who knows, perhaps successes are merely monstrosities which chance has smiled upon. Everyday life already imposes a certain order in all this chaos, a certain economy in all this profligacy, compared with so-called higher and specialized activities, and compared to moments, the everyday appears as ambiguous as it does trivial, and yet it is the spontaneity nobody can do without, and yet, compared with nature, it is already more ordered and more beautiful, and more economical with its means and its ends, unmediated and endured by those who live it. The everyday acts as mediator between nature and culture. The false light which bathes it grows dim and is outshone by the true clarity of critique. At the same time, its apparent solidity bursts asunder to reveal it as the point where nature and culture come together. Culture, which perpetuates this situation, is dismantled theoretically, and nature regains its strength, but far away from man and the human, which now must be redefined. The theory of moments will allow us to follow the birth and formation of moments in the substance of the everyday in their various psychic and sociological denominations, attitudes, aptitudes, conventions, effective or abstract stereotypes, formal intentions, etc. Perhaps it will even permit us to illuminate the slow stages by which need becomes desire, deep below everyday life, and on its surface. But most importantly, it must be capable of opening a window on supersession, and of demonstrating how we may resolve the age-old conflicts between the everyday and tragedy, and between triviality and festival. Volume 111, From Modernity to Modernism Towards a Metaphilosophy of Daily Life. Preface presentation. 20 years after Michel Trebitsch, this book represents a leave-taking instance, for Henri Lefebvre himself, long cycle, wholly unpremeditated at its inception, extending from Volume 1 of Critique of Everyday Life, published in 1947, to the third volume, which dates from 1981. The philosopher, who had retired in 1973, died